Hello everybody, my name is Claudia Kemfert. I'm really pleased to be here with you today. I will talk about climate protection in the city of tomorrow. Cities are responsible for around 3/4 of global CO2 emissions. They therefore have a key role to play in achieving the goal of net zero emissions globally by 2050 to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. On the other hand, being mobile is a must for all of us. But today's mobility comes at a very high price. Environmental pollution, global warming, traffic congestion, noise, dirt, accidents. For many, the car is just a necessary evil. But how will we be mobile in the future? And what is the role of future transportation? How will it contribute to global warming and also to climate protection? And what can cities do to reach all these goals? This is basically what I will talk about to you here today. I've prepared some slides and will show you some recent studies we did on that topic. As you can see here, the global greenhouse gas emissions need to be reduced drastically already quite soon. In order to reach the 1.5 degrees Paris climate target, the emissions need to go down very soon and very steep. The longer we wait, the more difficult it will be to reach those targets. As you can see here, delaying the peak by further 7 years, for example, by just discussing about coal phase outs or the other, too little time will be left to transform the economy. So the sooner we start to decrease emissions, the better and the more options we have. As you can see here, the planned measures for Germany are those to reduce emissions drastically by 2030. Climate protection goals in Germany are that way that each sector needs to meet a concrete emission reduction target in order to keep the climate goals the German government has decided to reach. And as you can see here, this is only the transportation sector that the projection of the future might look in that way that there will be a gap of climate action until 2030 as long we do not really change and reach the climate goals in that way that the emissions in the transportation sector decline even further. Though we see here that in a recent study we have done also for the German Advisory Council on the Environment that the gap of climate action by 2030 might reach a substantial amount of emissions, over 100 million by 2030. And the reason is that the longer we wait also to transform the transportation sector, the more difficult it will be to be in line with the Paris Agreement of greenhouse gas reduction. Here you see the share of transport and CO2 emissions in Germany, and you see both two sectors which are really important. On the one hand, it's energy still, because there's still a very high share of coal, which drives the share up. But on the other hand, the second or the third here, but the second important of protection and also for climate reduction goals or emission reduction goals for climate protection is the transportation sector. As you can see, it's approximately 20% of the share of total emissions, and both the road passenger transportation but also road freight transport is quite important. And what we have looked in a recent study for the German Advisory Council on the Environment is that we have looked at the road passenger transport modes in order to get the emissions down. And why it is important, the next slides show. The greenhouse gas development of selected sectors you see here is, you see a pretty much fever curve of many sectors that go up and down a little bit in the past, depending on the economic development, but also on the climate protection measures. And you see here the household sector, for example, the energy sector, But which is important is the line, the red line at the very up level, where you can see that the transportation sector has not managed to reduce emissions in the last years. Now, because of Corona, the emissions are going down a little bit, but not because of climate protection measures. And the major reason for the increase is a steep increase of road passenger transportation, especially the increased amounts of cars and the kilometers driven by cars. And the cars are more efficient, but they are also more heavy than in the past. And this is the reason why the emissions are going up and not down. So we need a U-turn, we need a system that brings the emissions down, and there are several ways in order to reach that. So a rerouting is necessary, or a U-turn in the energy and in the transportation transition. This is meaning that we need a substantial climate protection through a transport transformation. And how this transition can look like, we have analyzed in our study. The possibilities to decarbonize the full economy shows, you see here, is on the left-hand side, there is the energy system as it is still right now, ongoing, which is based on oil, coal, and gas, and a little bit of nuclear, which is the energy which is used both for the mobility demand, but also for the electricity demand. So with coal, for example, or nuclear power plants, we produce electricity that is, on the other hand, used also for the electricity demand. And in the future, in order to decarbonize the full system, the emissions need to go down. So we will need more renewable energy, and this renewable energy share will increase, both solar, wind, geothermal, biomass you see here. And these renewable energies produce, on the one hand, electricity, which goes again into mobility demand, but also in the electricity demand, but also in the heating sector by both, for example, by heat pumps usage, or by producing hydrogen or power to X, which is a synthetic fuel. And what we will see in the future with the full decarbonization is that we will have a 100% renewable energy base, which is producing electricity. And this electricity is either transformed to fuels, for example, or directly used in the mobility sector, or in the electricity, or in the heating sector by using the electricity also for heating purposes. So everything is interconnected based on 100% renewable energy. And here is a slide in showing how this is looking like, because in those times where we have a large share of renewable energy, we will have phases where we produce a lot of electricity. For example, if there's a lot of wind ongoing, if there's sunshine, we produce excess electricity, surplus electricity, and this should be used first by electric cars because it's more efficient, by rail transportation, and also by public transportation in the broader sense. So electricity first, renewables first, efficiency first, and then in those areas where we cannot use the electricity directly, we will produce, for example, hydrogen, and use it for long distance trucks, or use also CO2 emissions and produce synthetic fuels, which is methane emissions, and use that, for example, for long distance trucks, for ships, or for planes, and in order to also be mobile in all other sectors where the electricity is not being able to used directly. So we could use it directly in several areas with electric mobility, with heat pumps in the building sector, and public transportation, and rail transportation, and all the rest. But for those areas where we need some kind of new fuels, we need to produce that and use that in different kind of transportation areas. So here you see the overall energetic efficiency, that is the different ways of producing or using electricity or renewable electricity in different ways. On the up level, you see the renewable power, which could be and should be used directly in battery electric. And this is here on the right-hand side, that you see that we have a huge efficiency, because the direct usage brings you much more energy efficiency than producing, for example, hydrogen, which is used in a fuel cell car, and then you need a battery again and have an electric motor. At the end, you see at the low level here, that the 25 to 35% of the efficiency is left. So you are losing a large amount of energy in the way of using it. And if you would also produce synthetic fuel, which is here power to X, which is power to gas, and that way you produce with electrolysis hydrogen, and then you add again CO2, and then you get at the end a synthetic fuel, which is called power to X. And if you do that, you're losing even more energy in the meantime. And this is why it's so important to use the electricity directly and use it in a battery car, a battery truck, or whatever battery vehicle which is available in the future, the better. So you're saving a lot of electricity, which is really important, and not to waste the important renewable electricity, and use it directly and increase the efficiency drastically. As you can see here, the battery costs for electric cars have been fallen dramatically, and they are even falling right now even further. And this is why this is because both the innovation is ongoing, the technological progress which brings the material costs down, and on the other hand, the market is increasing, and this is why the demand for electric cars are increasing as well. And this brings the cost even more down. But you can see also here it's three top concerns about electric vehicles. If the people or the car owner wants to buy a new car, is on the one hand the price, and which is quite higher than conventional car, and also a used car, for example. And the second is 60% the charging infrastructure, which needs to be extended, and also is the technology ready? A lot of people ask, but in those countries, for example, Norway, which already have a very high share of electric vehicles, everything is solved, so the electric car is quite popular. So you need to reduce the advantages of conventional cars, and need to increase also the opportunities for new cars, and especially electric cars, in order to get a different balance, to reduce the conventional cars and bring more electric cars into the system. In Germany, we have now a buyer's premium that if you are buying a new electric car, you get a certain payment for it, but as long as the advantages for diesel and gasoline cars are as high as they have been in the past, it's not very attractive to buy an electric car. But even now, with the new development of bringing more market incentives into the system, this might change also in the future. Now, with the external costs of transport, it's always important to get some kind of cost comparison and a cost truth, so to say, because the external costs of transportation are quite high. This is in German, in showing the external costs in both accidents, and this is quite substantial with cars and motorcycles, which brings the highest external costs. Second is climate, which means climate damages because of burning gasoline and diesel, which increases also the greenhouse gases and the climate damages, as well as the particulates and also the pollution in the cities, which shows here, which is also quite substantial, measured in billion euro. Of course, the accidents, the external cost of accidents are very high, but followed also by different kind of other options, also related to noise and the nature impact the transportation has. And this is also for comparison that the costs, the external costs have been almost doubled in the last 10 years, and it should be the other way around. We should have been able in the last 10 years to reduce those costs, especially after the last financial crisis. We spent a lot of money in order to bring the economy back on track, but what we missed is that we really decoupled the economic growth from fossil fuel demand, especially gasoline and diesel, and spend too much money for road transport, for conventional road transport, which brings even more costs and negative external costs to the overall system. And this needs to be changed, completely changed in the future. Now, the climate protection, I already mentioned that there is a gap of climate protection in the future, which is quite substantial related to transportation. We should need to reduce the emissions much faster than we plan to. In Germany, there is a climate plan, but the existing measures are not enough in order to reach the intended goals of the Paris Agreement. So even we need approximately 100 million emissions to decline by 2030 in order to be in line with the target. And that means a substantial more effort to reduce emissions in the transportation sector. Now we have studied the full package of decarbonizing the transportation sector, and it's important to see this cascade of opportunities, which means that we cannot continue as we did in the past because we are on the wrong path, on the wrong way, so to say. And what we need to do first and foremost is to reduce the total traffic drastically. So in order we cannot only to replace the cars in Germany, which are right now 47 million cars on the streets in Germany, and just replace a diesel and gasoline engine with an electric engine. But what we need to do is really to optimize the full mode and to reduce the wasted traffic, so to say, all the congestion we see, all the cars which stands as 23 hours a day on parking spaces and are not driving. They are standing vehicles and not driving vehicles. And that is the first thing. The second is to bundle and combine also traffic flows, meaning we have to increase the rail transportation and make it more attractive, both economically but also from the comfort point of view, and also combine the different traffic flows more efficiently in order to really reduce the overall transportation, and switch also to low carbon transport modes. That's in first and foremost the rail transportation, both for passengers but also for freight, and use this as much as we can and bring new climate friendly fuels in all sectors, but also use more electric mobility in the broader sense. Energy efficiency improvement is important, but we know from the past that the rebound effect is really strong, meaning the car engines are more efficient, but the car itself is becoming bigger and more heavier, and that contradicts the goal of reducing the fossil fuel demand. So there is this kind of rebound effect. And if we have managed to really reduce the overall transportation by this cascade of reduction, And then at the end, we can use also renewable fuels, and electricity and renewable fuels is really important, because if we produce hydrogen, it needs to be renewable and not gray or blue, whatever color or yellow color. It needs to be green. And basically, renewable fuels need to be sustainable renewable fuels, and the rest should be electric. And then we can reach this 2050 greenhouse gas neutral transport. That's the goal. Now, as I already said, we do not have really mobile vehicles or driving vehicles. We have standing vehicles. That means that 70% of all journeys are under 10 kilometers. 20 or over 90% of the total vehicles in Germany, for example, stand 23 hours a day. So they are only driving 1 hour a day, stand the whole night, stand most of the day. So the journeys we are driving are very short. And this is why electric mobility is really optimal for these kind of transportation, because the short distance you see here below 10 kilometer or even below 25 kilometers, it's no problem at all with an electric car. And this is why, on the one hand, we should reduce the standing vehicles. We need only to drive, and this is where digitalization can play a crucial role, and also optimizing and offering mobility services, and avoid that the cars and all vehicles stand the whole day. The second thing is the environmental harmful subsidies needs to be reduced. And for example, in Germany, in the transportation sector, it's approximately 30 billion euros a year. And you see there are many of them, but only for example, the VAT exemption for international flights, it's approximately 5 billion. And the tax reduction for diesel is not understandable at all. It's over 7 billion a year. And commuting allowances, for example, but also the tax exemptions for kerosene, which should be avoided in order to really balance and bring more incentives for sustainable and climate neutral fuels and electricity transportation into the system. We really need to reduce and avoid environmental harmful subsidies. Now here you see the recommendations we did from the German Advisory Council on the Environment, where we have done a study on the decarbonization of the transportation sector, and it shows some examples of a full range of different kind of measures, which to our opinion we need in Germany in order to reduce emissions, starting from a quota for cars or e-vehicles. For new cars, we suggest to have a 25% new registration, fully battery electric vehicles by 2025, and 50% by 2030, in order to bring new cars into the system. This kind of quota, to our opinion, makes a lot of sense. It goes with the speed limits on motorways. It's a very controversial discussion point in Germany, but nevertheless it brings the emissions down. Binding speed limit of maximum 130 kilometers an hour, or also the vehicle incentive or efficiency incentives, which is also important, and the route dependent car and truck tolls, also the reform of taxes and charges, meaning that the beneficial situation for conventional vehicles should be reduced, and CO2-based taxes increase, and the other taxes reduce, which distort the market, and also bring more renewable energy into the system. As I already said, the abolition of environmental harmful subsidies, and also the reform of the passenger transport law. I will briefly show you what we mean with this also in a second. Now, what is really needed is a U-turn in the transportation transition, meaning that we see, for example, in the last year in Germany, 1/3 of newly registered cars in Germany were SUVs. And over 1 million SUVs were newly registered last year. And that's a large amount of numbers. And if you look that these kind of SUVs all drive either diesel, mostly diesel or gasoline, we see that's not on the right track. Not on the right pathway, and the car density is still very high. It's rising up to 576 67 cars per 1,000 inhabitants. That's extraordinarily high. A car reduction would be necessary in order to be on track also with the decarbonization of the transportation system. So we need a completely U-turn, a mobility transition, and the trend needs to be changed. And this meaning not only that we need smaller cars, electric cars, climate-friendly cars, but also less cars, more mobility services, and we need to be mobile everywhere as much as we can. But this does not necessarily mean that we need to have an own vehicle, an own car, which we drive with diesel or gasoline. So that's that the whole system needs to change here dramatically. So a restart would be really important. As I already said, we need renewable energy they need to increase dramatically and drastically. We should use it, the renewable electricity, also in the building sector for transportation. This is what we call a so-called sector coupling, and electric car quota is important, and also the strengthening of the rail transportation, and also the reform of taxes. That means also a CO2 tax would be necessary, and a mobility bonus after this corona crisis in order to be mobile, and not a car bonus which goes even further in the wrong direction. Few points now on the sustainable urban area. So sustainable mobility is much more than climate protection, especially if we look at cities and urban areas. And here it's important to look what kind of challenges here we're facing in order to be more sustainable in the broader sense, and also to contribute to climate protection, which is also important in the cities. And what can we learn here from the corona situation for the time after the crisis? So we see on the one hand that people cycle and walk more. That's good because this is good for the health. On the other hand, the car seems to be some kind safe vehicle for the pandemic situation, a virus-free area, and we are driving even more and use less public transportation. This is a trend we should reverse after, so to say, the corona crisis. We need more public transportation and less car driving. So in the city, this means that we need more space that must be made available for cycling and walking, and less for cars and all the car spaces. So the infrastructure must be massively expanded. And for this, we need not only more money, but above all, we need also planners and new rules and new laws according to which the space is distributed. And this is a crucial part of it, because we really need to look also in the regulation and the law that brings us solutions that are right now basically a favorite for cars. So we are living in car-friendly cities. In the future, we want to live in human-friendly cities, and human means also cycling and walking and using public transportation, and for humans, and not primarily made for cars. And one serious issue is here the road safety. We see that a lot of injured and killed people in urban areas are basically from the bicycle side. We see here that it's still very high, even though it has been a little bit declined after 1990, but nevertheless, it's still very high. And this is a trend which should not be in that way. It should be the opposite. But the reason is that the more cars are in the cities, the less space is left for cycling and walking. And this is why it's really an issue to increase the safety in the urban areas and cities and bring more space to this part. And shared mobility and mobility as a service is one part of the solution. So what I already said is that the car-friendly city is also based on the status symbol the car has been had been in the past, in the last decades, and this now needs to be changed in the future, that it's not a car which is a status symbol, but what we need is a mobility as a service. So we need different kind of platforms and various kind of mobility offers, from planning, booking, and billing, and need this data which needs to be available in different kind of areas in order to bring them together. And the hopes for the positive environmental effects did not happen in the past in that way. And here you see, for example, in New York City, the traffic mode, which is ongoing instead of ride hailing, we see that on the one hand, that's good, that more public transportation is used and also active mobility, but on the other hand, taxi is also used more heavily. So what we on the one hand need is both that public transportation needs to become more attractive, mobility as a service, but also on the other hand, walking and cycling needs to be more safe and more attractive. And if there's a car transportation, it needs to be climate friendly, and also for example, the delivery of goods in that area should be made with electric cars and electric vehicles instead of gasoline and diesel cars. So any kind of transportation with taxi or carpooling and all the rest should be climate friendly. And this brings us also to the spatial control or the shared mobility, which is also necessary, and because sharing is also important for this active mobility, which is right now available. But right now there's no economic incentives for suppliers to develop the last mile, and that's even important because if you go with the S-Bahn or the U-Bahn, with metro, then you need also to come home on the last mile, and this needs to be improved. And there could be a linking permission for sharing providers to public interests and a stronger spatial control. And how this works already show different kind of studies. Now we are looking also on the economic incentives for less car or for less parking permits, for example, and more using the space for walking or cycling and increasing the space for humans, not for cars. We see here in Berlin that parking takes up much public space and is very, very cheap. And this is the reason why parking takes much of the public space. So you see here for a resident parking permit, it costs 3 cents per day, or 0.03 euros per day. and that's not a lot in comparison to, for example, parking a scrap container, which costs €3 a day, or a stand on a weekly market, which costs 12.5 euros per day. And this shows this is extremely cheap also in comparison to other countries, which is far, far below of the international standards. And in the international comparison, we see this is a very reduced price. It could be increased quite easily, but for this we need a new law and also regulation in order to offer and bring these incentives into the system. So what we did is to provide a lot of recommendation for our urban mobility, which are based both on push instruments and pull instruments, and both are very important. So on the push instruments, you see here, we have summarized issues or instruments like to introduce a distance-based car toll or shortage of price and parking space, as I already said, and the tempo 30, for example, control speed, and also to facilitate parking space pricing, which we see here as two crucial areas for push instrument. But pull instruments is also providing opportunities and provide priorities, for example, to public transport and non-motorized traffic, or also to use mobility management and also expand the foot and bicycle traffic infrastructure and offer for this a lot of pull options for the people in the city and the urban areas, and make the integrated transport development and the planning binding. And with this, we really need also reforming of the road traffic law and the regulations we have here, and combine this also with digital infrastructures. Now, to finish, what we really need, what I made clear, is that we need to have a restart of the traffic, turnaround of a traffic transition. On the one hand, for example, to ban short distance flights is one issue, to expand the rail infrastructure in order to bring the people in the trains and not in the planes. And the pricing comparison is quite substantial, so it should be the opposite. The flight should be more expensive than the train tickets, for example. We need some kind of regulation here, and what we need is a people friendly city instead of a car friendly city, more space for people, safe bicycle lanes, and also footpath, and fewer standing vehicles. So the parking space pricing, the parking space is too cheap, and we should to avoid that there are so many standing vehicles. So we need mobility for sure, but make it attractive, make it also comfortable with public transportation, and offer also digital opportunities and mobility as a service. And we see a lot of potential of electric mobility with small, light cars in combination with renewable electricity and autonomous driving. The digitalization will bring a lot of opportunities also for rural areas, not only for urban areas, because there you have a less density of population and need also to offer electric cars and have a better loading infrastructure than in the city. And the transport system transformation creates also huge economic opportunities, especially also for car companies in Germany and the whole related economic factor. So the crisis restart is a huge opportunity. We see 4Ds. On the one hand, the decarbonization, bringing the emissions down, digitalization. The digitization is to use also mobility as a service, combine different mobility modes together in order to also increase the efficiency, decentralization in the sectors, and bring more also opportunities and attractive options in rural areas for cycling, for public transportation, and democratization, increase the participation, and have a people based mobility and not purely a car based mobility. With this, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. If you have further questions, contact me. All the studies I've presented here, especially those of the Advisory Council on the Environment, are available also on the webpage. We can offer this for you and the other studies as well. With this, I would like to close. Thank you so much for your attention and wish you all a very good day.